And I just recorded our first podcast. I want to call you nonlinear, though. Do you go by Johnny or nonlinear? We just recorded.
Oh, yeah.
Guys, we just recorded our first podcast.
It was awesome. It was super. I have a list of things. I have this list in front of me.
The first thing I want to start with is actually at the bottom of our list, which is the fact that both of us have noticed that really smart people don't get farcaster. Why aren't smart people who are talking on Twitter, what isn't clicking for them? Why aren't they getting it the same way that you and I get it?
Yeah, we have the advantage of having been super early and been part of the journey. So, I mean, I remember when there was no such thing called Warpcast. It was all just Farcaster. And then they were like, oh, well, we're going to make it, Warpcast is the app, Farcaster is the protocol. And like, so how many times have you seen the following interaction? Someone has a good idea, they share the idea, and then Dan says, that's a great opportunity for another client. Like we've been told the story over and over and over again, just because we're there early and we're there often. A lot of people, I think, coming in without any context, they like saw a tweet from a big account, a couple weeks ago. They show up and they have like none of that context. So they're just like, I don't know what's going on here. And their mental model, like they're not sort of like protocol pilled, like all the sort of crypto people are. So they're just like, it's just an app. It's just an app like Reddit or Twitter or Instagram or whatever. That's why I think people, it's not like clicking right away. It's just because you need actually quite a bit of context to get on board. And then even when people explain it, like I've heard people go, oh, well, all the casts are on chain. It's like, no, they're not. That's not how it works. But I think there's this other thing where like crypto people just kind of assume like, well, I understand how, blockchain works. And so that must be what's going on here because there's like all these crypto people. There's like this iceberg of knowledge and it's not evenly distributed, which is fine. I think that what Dan and Varun are building is still valuable without needing all of that knowledge, which is great. But yeah, I think that that's my best explanation for why otherwise really smart people see Warpcast and then like make all these assumptions that are just wrong.
I agree with that. And you're right. Like we do have the benefit of having been early. In addition to that, I think that there needs to be a better way to describe the distinction beyond just email and Gmail or Yahoo Mail. The average email user doesn't understand that there's a protocol that email is operating on. That's not intuitive either. Even when I use that with my friends, they're like, wait, what? And the way that I've ended up describing it is like, okay, imagine if Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, like all you had to do was use the same account to sign into all of the above. And for them, that's a better click for them because they're like, oh, I got it. Imagine if they're just like all built in the same quote unquote internet network, whatever platform. And all you need to do is like port over your profile from one to the next and you bring your followers with you. And they were like, oh, okay, that makes like way more sense. So you're saying I don't need to necessarily start from zero. And I was like, no, you don't need to start from zero.
Yeah, it's tough. I think that the like protocol versus client difference only really matters and is felt when there are different clients. And there's like analogies you can make to other things. Like I think the email analogy is pretty good, but also like if all you've ever used is Gmail, it doesn't really matter because one total fucking boomer analogy that I've been playing with that I actually really like, but is not going to be well understood, I think, with younger people is radio, like the radio. You have these radio stations.
Yeah.
And they're just out there in the air, like it's public. And anyone from a phone, from a car radio, from like whatever, can just tune to the right frequency and like listen to the radio. That's interesting because anyone can tune into the same radio station from any different device, from anywhere. It doesn't really matter. And that's how I think about the network of Farcaster hubs. Yeah, it's not a perfect analogy, but it's like another way of thinking about this network of hubs that are synchronizing state and writing state is like, it's public. Yeah. Anyone can read it from any device and write to it. It's more akin to like a infrastructure like that. Like or like roads, radio, like
Radio is a lot better. I
do you
actually
think
think
so?
radio is, and yeah, I think the radio, because to your point, people are only using one email client ever. And I think radio is so much more interesting to be using because it's very intuitive. Like you understand that there's different stations and different people can like radio in and like broadcast. And I think to me, that's a better analogy than email.
I think the thing too is like we're in this part of the timeline with Farcaster where Warpcast is the dominant client, and so
Yeah.
you don't feel there's like the shift that happens with the internet itself. Like you create a Gmail account, you have your email, and then you go to like a library and then you sign into your Gmail account and you're like, oh, all my stuff is here. And then
Yeah.
you're like, oh, it's on the internet. It's like not on the box. And I
Yeah.
think you need those kind of like visceral light bulb moments for the tech to kind of click. And I think that while we're in this phase where everything is just like on Workcast for the most part, you can imagine like a TikTok like client or an Instagram like client gaining a lot of adoption. And then you sign into that client and you're like, oh, everything is here. Like all the followers are here. And I actually use both of these clients on a daily basis because they're differentiated enough. That's when things are like really going to click. But until we get to that point, I think it's just going to be like, it's just Warpcast, you know, and like all the nerdy crypto protocol stuff just like is irrelevant and probably just confusing.
I think this is another reason why people don't get it is because they're approaching it the way that they've approached like other quote unquote decentralized social networks, which I think have just gotten it wrong. And you could tell this on the interview with the chopping block. Like they kept thinking about it from like a financialization standpoint. And I was like, oh, if you're building with financialization as the goal, you're going to end up with a very different app and protocol than if you're building with a social network and connectivity on chain as your guiding star, your North Star. And so I think that was another thing is they were like, oh, well, like you're paying for the protocol, like you're paying for your Farcaster account. And I was like, yes, like I would rather pay for my Farcaster account than have people buy and trade shares of me. I think because of that, the value add is very different. And I think that in and of itself is another reason why like people don't get it in crypto sometimes is because they're using this mental model of, it's what Chris Dixon called like, oh, the casino versus the computer is like a lot of people look at decentralized social from the casino mindset instead of looking at it from like oh, this is a social network. Like the whole purpose of a social network is to connect people who wouldn't otherwise be connected in person. And the reason why it's on chain is because I believe the economy is a product of society, right? Like economics is literally like, how do you distribute limited resources throughout society? Having your social network on chain just allows the economics part to happen a lot more efficiently and a lot more transparently. And instead of using that as a framework, they're literally using like us as transactional elements or like assets that can be bought and sold instead of thinking about like, oh, actually, I want to be the one buying and selling actual things that I would in society by using the social network. I think a lot of people who did really well in DeFi and who did really well in speculative NFT stuff so far haven't been able to shift out of.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's this conception that you have like sort of degen DeFi people and they're dirty, and then you have nerdy Web3 people and they're clean. And that's like that's like, these are like these sort of, you know, personas or these like tropes. I think there's truth to that, but I also think that it's totally wrong. A lot of the people that I've met, a lot of the really, really smart, very capable builders are fucking total degenerates. Like
they're the most degenerate I've ever met.
People ever, but they're also the most reputable. Like they've built real shit, real tech, like real innovation. They really understand the space and they like to have fun. And then I also think that like the people that we were like, oh, they're just degens, they're just DeFi traders, whatever. They're actually total like gigabrain, like brilliant people.
Yeah.
Like Jacek, is that how you pronounce his name?
Yes, Jacek.
Like, yeah. I mean like
gigabrain. Yeah.
Total galaxy brain, like super impressive. Like
Yeah.
like rivals anything that any like, you know, Web3 builder has made, in my opinion, like by far. Like, so
Oh,
I think that it's a useful lens through which to look at crypto, which is the computer and the casino. I just don't think like, I don't think it always maps to reality. Like, I think that
I agree.
oftentimes that's a very, very, very blurry line. Even like with what we've been doing, like what we've been building with Hypersub, it's like pretty heavily financialized in a lot of interesting ways, but it's also kind of oriented towards artists and creators. And I think like I've been thinking about this casino analogy a lot, which is like
I can tell. Also, I agree. It's like not black and white and it's not a dichotomy. I think the most impressive people, I agree, are those who can merge the two together in a meaningful way. And I think JSIC has done it. I think Hypersub and CrowdFi have done it. Like you could even say that like I'm in a way doing it with Club TED too.
I was thinking about like this casino analogy and I was kind of like going deeper into it. And I'm like, you've been to Las Vegas, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Las Vegas is fucking awesome. There's all kinds of stuff happening in Vegas that isn't just pure gambling. There's sporting events, there's shows, there's comedy, there's music. It reminds me of like going to the mall when I was a kid. It was like, yes, there's commerce there, but there's also all kinds of other things that are happening. And I think like that's where the deeper you look, I think, into crypto, you find like it's very, very blurry. You know, the things that seem like really financialized are actually kind of social, and the things that are like seem really social under the hood are using novel financial mechanics. I think we're just as a space trying to figure out what is the right combination of these things. I think there's a Goldilocks zone, which is where you don't want to be too over financialized and you also don't want to completely ignore a lot of the primitives available within crypto. I think we're just trying to figure out where is that Goldilocks zone. You know, it can drift too far in one direction or the other. Anyway.
And this is where I think JSIC nailed it, was that he started with degen, right? And it was basically like, oh, everyone's doing these airdrops and they're like super not sophisticated and I want to raise the bar. So it started with degen and then was like, actually, here's how you can get the next degen. It like introduced this concept of tipping, which I think is valuable socially. Obviously, you can gift warps, but for people who want to do more than warps, it gives them an option. Of course, there's going to be bad actors who only do that and it feels spammy. But after a while, I don't know. It's like you're exposed to it so much that like now it doesn't bother me. Like I think at the beginning, I was like, oh, this is annoying. And now I'm like, okay, like it doesn't bother me. He then released an API for it. And so that others can start building on top of it. And so as much as I was anti-degen, I recognized that it brought in a ton of people into farcaster ecosystem. Granted, it definitely coincided with the launch of Frames too. So it's kind of like two things at once. And then Frames could enable degen distribution. And he continued to evolve it and like continues to think through like, okay, what's next for this? Like, how can I use this and build on top of farcaster and then outside of farcaster as well? And so to your point, I agree it can be a little bit reductive to think casino versus computer, when at the end of the day, if a social network is just like society on chain, then there's always going to be an element of fun and gambling and then also an element of seriousness. And you kind of need both.
Yeah, I agree. I think the timing, I totally agree with what you're saying with regard to the timing. I think Who as well, like it was largely adopted by Farcaster native people. Like Oxen was a big champion of it. And so I think that was important, you know, that it didn't feel like an outside thing. It felt like an inside thing.
I actually found out about degen because I started getting Twitter notifications about it. And I was like, what the hell? I'm like, why am I getting tagged in this like meme coin thing? And then all of a sudden I was like, oh wait, like this actually went from Farcaster to Twitter and like not the other way around, which was wild.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many fascinating things about degen. Like the other thing, it was a channel native thing. And I've been like leaning into Dan being like, you need to give better economic tools to channel hosts. Like channels, like one of the things that people said from the very beginning of Farcaster is probably like one of the first or second things I ever casted, which was this feels really cool. How do you preserve it as it scales? All networks want to get bigger. And this is no different. And the community here, the culture here is so strong. How how are you going to scale this? And that question has just come up over and over and over again. And the answer is channels. Degen, what's fascinating is that they kind of bootstrapped their own meme coin, their own their own like novel mechanics for tipping. They kind of just permissionlessly created all of these interesting economic tools. And I think are a big part of what has caused this recent spike in farcaster. What's the tail and what's the dog? Like did degen getting really big, did that happen? Was that drafting off of farcaster's growth, or it is all this, you know, new inbound interest in farcaster a result of degen just like mooning? Maybe it's probably a little bit of both, but like I think there's something so powerful by having small communities that can create their own memes and their own culture, and then giving that sort of organism economic tools. I think there's super powerful things that can happen there, and I think degen is like a proto example of that. And I hope that as they continue to iterate on channels at the protocol level, that it does include like economic levers that the channel hosts and participants can turn. Because I just think it's an unexplored, fascinating design space. To your point, they're social in nature, but they're also economic in nature. And that to me is the exciting piece about crypto. And I think like Warpcast channels are like right on that bleeding edge.
There's 2 channels that have skyrocketed in the last month and that are now the top 2 channels, which is degen and base. When the degen stuff was happening, I pretty much just like started unfollowing.
There's actually a nickname for you as a result of this.
I boycotted. I boycotted when they created the degen. Yeah. I left and was like, I'm not doing this. I lasted all of like 4 days. I couldn't do it. The point is like, even now, however many, I guess it's like a month later, is that it's the #1 channel. And somehow they have designed my main feed experience and my client experience so that like I actually don't see degen stuff. And so it's the most popular, most active channel, and they're thriving. Their culture's there. Like I know about it. I can opt into it. But for the most part, my day-to-day experience on Warpcast is completely untouched by it, except for perhaps like the tipping replies. And I do like the economics around it. I think you and I have been like testing this a little bit, rewarding people with warps when we could gift warps before degen came out, of being like, people are responding when I was like, I'll gift you 100 warps if you have a really good answer to this. So people always respond to some sort of economic incentive. And so like, it'll be interesting to see how channels, I agree, should be financialized. If I could charge $1 for my TED channel, I would immediately, even at the risk of 3,000 people more dropping off. I would still do it because I'd rather have engaged people there than not. One issue I have with general social media is that it's created these echo chambers and silos where it amplifies a lot of the polarization we see today. And so I'd be really interested to understand, how are they designing these? I think we're already starting to see engagement or discussion or like thoughtful debate on here in a way that you can't, especially on Twitter.
I think of that as like a feed problem, like
a feed problem.
Yeah, like a and a kind of a client issue. Like so I imagine if the farcaster network gets what it wants, which is massive growth and adoption, like you'll see everything happening on that network. And I mean everything from like the worst, like just trenches of the internet, like 4chan level awfulness, all the way up to like pioneering academic research. Like in the same way that like that's happening with email, you know, like look at the number of emails that are sent in a 24-hour period. The range of things that are covered, the range of human activity that's covered in email in a given day is just like enormous. If farcaster succeeds, then you'll see the exact same thing. This kind of goes back to the radio analogy. If you think about the radio spectrum, there's all these radio waves, and some of them are just static noise, and some of them are things you don't care about.
I think I'm like more interested in how can channels evolve in a way that doesn't continue to amplify polarization the way that other social platforms have enabled.
Other things are things you really care about, and what the client does, or in the radio analogy, what the transceiver does is it tunes.
Yeah.
You're like, oh, I want to hear public radio, I want to hear classical music, I want to hear whatever.
Radio is an infinitely better analogy.
So
by the way,
this is like
we need to convince everyone of this.
That's how I'm thinking about it. Is like a farcaster client is like a transceiver. You can use it to tune to the frequencies that you're interested in. And I think like Warpcast is doing a great job in the feed where you're like, okay, even if it feels like blowing up and I follow people who are posting in that channel, it doesn't blow up my feed. feed algorithm kind of within the client, you'd be like, okay, there's all these interesting things happening across all these different channels. How do we surface the best so that we don't, have this echo chamber? That's an opinionated client design decision. Like, I think that there's going to be other clients that are like, here's the fire hose, just like drink fire hose. And like, so I think it's up to the individual user to decide what sort of experience that they're looking for.
Yeah.
I don't really see it as like,
you're right,
a channel
I agree
problem. Yeah.
It's not a channel design. I agree. It's an app design. I just like assume, again, the whole farcaster warpcast, I just still see it as like one and the same until there are other compelling clients. But I agree. And I think, are we going to be more of like the TikTok style algo where like you are just in your own zone? Or are we going to be more like Substack, discovery, like thoughtful interaction, engagement? And I think it's exciting for someone like me to then be like, okay, I can actually join a client that will have a lot of other people who are like-minded having these discussions here. And I will be able to find them on other clients as well. I don't know. I'm just excited for what people can design. Although I do really trust in the Warpcast team. So what is the app that's going to get most of my time outside of Warpcast?
I'm like secretly hoping for some app developer to just like totally come out of left field and make something that's categorically different from Warpcast. That's like a TikTok-like experience, but that under the hood uses Farcaster for like messaging, like broadcasting messages. If you think about the Farcaster protocol as an independent entity from like Merkle, like it's its own thing. Like, what does that thing want? And it wants usage. It wants volume.
Yes.
Right now, the primary driver of that volume is Warpcast, but the protocol itself is indifferent to that. It doesn't care if it comes from Warpcast or something else. And I think in order for it to get really big, like it needs many other things. Again, so there's going to be, I think, key clients that drive a lot of usage, and those are going to be super important. But really, like you have to have more than one, I think, in order to really work.
This is, again, like going back to JSIC, degen is, I think he could build an amazing client on top of Farcaster that's completely degen oriented. And you can think of it as almost like an arcade or like even like a legitimate casino, right? Like you go to the casino and like when you're gambling with your friends, or the sharks at the poker table, and like, okay, like that's fun. If he did it right now, I think it would be the second most popular app, and like not by a small percentage. Like the number of people, like just looking at degen as a channel, looking at the number of people who are using it, like I think the airdrop went to, I don't know, 6,000 people, but that's a decent amount because they're doing it every day. Like their daily active users would be high. Something that surprised me actually is how the news channel, and this kind of ties into another thing we wanted to talk about, was like the ephemeral event with the Super Bowl channel. When something happens in the world, like people do get their news from TikTok and Twitter. No one's getting their news from Warpcast. And I think once that starts happening, that will be one of the inflection points of growth, because as soon as something happens in the world, even if you hear an earthquake, I'm like, Twitter, like, is there an earthquake? Is it like, do we need journalists and media people on Farcaster to start producing some of that content? Or do we just need enough people talking about a current event in order to draw them over? It's a little bit of like the chicken and the egg. And then I think the apps that you can build around actual news become so much more interesting and engaging than going to a CNN app or the New York Times, or Apple News leaves so much to be desired, even though it is an aggregator of news. There's just so much potential and like so much left to be desired right now.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Like Twitter kind of dominates that place in people's mind where, like you said, when something happens, you just go to Twitter. Like if something real, like there's some global or national event that you need to know about and track with, Twitter still, I think, has just like owns that. That's a tall order. I mean, how many, like the number of people that like the homepage of Yahoo gets every day is like enormous. It's huge.
It's insane to me.
Yeah. And so that to me is like a testament to just like the durability of network effects. Like once you've achieved true network effect, it's extreme. Like, I mean, you almost need like a new generation of people to come up and be like, oh, well, I don't use Yahoo, I use Twitter. as my
Yeah.
source. And then you need the next generation to be like, I don't use Twitter, I use Warpcast, or I use, use something that's built on the Farcaster network.
I'm just trying to think, like, how do you even get there? And it's almost like it's like a problem for another time.
Yeah. It did achieve that with degen, right? Like degen, if you think about degen as like a news event within crypto, and the question is like, where do I go to find out about this? The answer was not Twitter. The answer was Farcaster. Same with Frames. Frames was like a Farcaster native thing, but like you needed to go to Warpcast to learn about Frames. And I think the more things for which that becomes true, the more that the network will achieve that kind of effect. And like Dan said something about this a while ago where he's like, the first year of Farcaster, there were big events taking place and there was zero discussion about it happening here. It was all on Twitter. And then the next year, there was like some other big event and there was like a little bit of discussion.
Like Terra blowing up.
Yes.
And then FTX in 2022.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think like the more that becomes true, like the more it will achieve what you're describing. But yeah, I think you need the people, like you need, and if you're trying to go after like mainstream news events, you probably need, mainstream news people to be more active on Farcaster.
Journalists are on Threads. And I'm like, why are you on Threads? Like, what is that doing? I think it's a missed opportunity for any journalist. I don't understand why CoinDesk, Blockworks, like all of those crypto native should be building their audience now, at least if you're not a brand, but as the journalist who's breaking the news. There's a very strong, smart crypto audience already, but also because it's only going to be better for you as a journalist to be able to build the audience here because you actually own it more than you would own it anywhere else. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a citizen journalist. That's not my aspiration, but it seems like a missed opportunity now not to exclusively break news on Warpcast. But again, they don't love it the same way that we love it.
I mean, I think for specific journalists, there's a huge opportunity right now to come in and just like dominate.
Right?
Yeah. Cause
like, I'm like, why would you?
Yeah. They could build a very, very big following very, very quickly if they just commit to Farcaster. I think for brands, it's different because they have distribution elsewhere.
That makes sense to me too.
Brand accounts on Threads or, Twitter or whatever. But yeah, for an individual, I think they could just, clean up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the future of any content, whether news or, lifestyle content, is creator-led. I fundamentally believe that because people want a personality to associate with, unless you're a brand like Apple. But any new and emerging brands, you need a personality the same way that I know Barry Weiss is an independent media, but like I'm blanking on the name of what her company is called, but I know it's hers.
Yeah. Trusted sources,
Yeah. And then from a brand perspective, I agree. They have distribution elsewhere. There's all these loyalty platforms right now, right? Like Web3 loyalty is having its moment. Investors have gone kind of through a cycle of like being bearish on loyalty and bullish on loyalty. And now they're like bullish on it again. But every loyalty platform is its own platform, which I think is a fail. If you're interacting with a brand, if you're interacting with a clothing brand that you love, you're not going to go to a different website to get points to then go use at that brand. You're only going to go direct to the brand. And I think all these loyalty platforms, if they're not figuring out a way to integrate into social networks, then for me, that's a miss. That's what you should be thinking about. A lot of consumerism is a social construct, like whether we like it or not. Where do you get your recommendations from? Like word of mouth from your friends. Oh, you see something on Instagram and then you want to buy it. Like most TikTok comments will be like, where's your necklace from? Where's your sweater from? People want to know that. It doesn't make sense to your point about distribution, but at least all of the loyalty platforms should be figuring out a way to integrate and so that they can actually be the ones to onboard, because what frames have shown us is that distribution's there. Why aren't loyalty platforms like figuring out a way to integrate, especially since you have a connected address, you can figure out how to connect it to whatever platform you're doing. And then once brands come, you're like, hey, we've already built the distribution mechanism for this. And then you have people like us who are large audiences, and all I need to do is cast a frame and my entire audience can use the loyalty platform's frame and you have immediate distribution. And I don't know if that makes intuitive sense when I say it out loud, but it's very, very clear in my brain. Yeah. This is a no-brainer for any brand. And you can't do that on Twitter. You can't do that on Instagram. You can't do that on TikTok. You can't do that like anywhere else.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this and it makes sense to me too. I think that it's so so early. I mean, Frames launched like 2 weeks ago.
A month ago?
Yeah, a month ago or whatever. So the way that I've been thinking about this is that, well, so it's sort of two disjointed thoughts. So the first is with crypto, I think a big question has been like, where will the abstractions be? So if you look at the internet itself, right, you have primitives like IP address, and then IP addresses got abstracted in the form of domain names. You had command line interfaces got abstracted. We had browsers, like the browser became the kind of primary abstraction surface for interacting with the internet. So I think like the same question around crypto, which is like, what is the abstraction? Like, are we all going to are we going to have EOAs? Are we all going to have to understand public-private key pairs, or is that going to get abstracted? Is MPC, our embedded wallets, like domain-specific wallets, is that the abstraction that's going to win? Or is it AA? Or like, where's the abstractions?
Yeah.
One thing that I think is emerging as an abstraction actually is farcaster, and specifically a farcaster frame. Because if you think about it, you've already done the upfront work to create a connected address, and so you can do things on chain with one click, like with one tap of a button, and like boom, you just minted an NFT, you bought Girl Scout cookies, you can do all these things. So I think like that's kind of one thought, which is farcaster as an abstraction for crypto as a whole. Farcaster, and in today's world, this is like Warpcast is the primary client, but like Warpcast as the abstraction layer of crypto is interesting, exciting, and I think plausible. So that's like a thought, a thesis I've been kind of like wondering. I'm like, oh shit, like are we all gonna just end up using crypto like via our farcaster feed, whether that
honestly I think so.
Yeah, so like maybe what's emerging before our eyes is the kind of crypto equivalent of Netscape, like I don't know, it's like a thought that I've had. So then adjacent thought is like why do anything on chain? Like, so we were talking about journalists, we were talking about brands, and I think Fred Wilson wrote about this recently. Zora, I think, has been thinking along these lines. We've been thinking a lot about this as well, like with regard to hypersub, which is like when people do things on chain, it's actually the intersection of two really important things, which is their interests and their purchases. So if you think about Google or Amazon queries, those are intents based on like, I want to buy this product. If you think about TikTok or Instagram, inputs to their algorithms, it's like, these are the things I'm interested in. And what happens on chain is the intersection of those two. So you're like, I'm interested in this and I'm going to mint it. And minting is actually like an economic action because there's money in it. And so what happens is now you have this representation of two things that is on this public ledger. You have interests and you have economic action, and it's public. So now other people can make use of that. The future that this creates is one where you can create super targeted offers. So for example, you can say anyone who's a member of Club TED gets a 20% discount on our product, and we can create this offer without having to talk to anybody else because Club TED subscription data and membership credentials are in this public forum. They're on this public computer called the EVM. And so you can imagine like it's like any brand can create any targeted offer to like any individual or group of individuals, and they can do that permissionlessly.
To like then take it a step further, even for all these people who are doing one-click mints right now, I can look and be like, oh, are you just somebody who mints everything they see? Or like, is this one of the few that you have minted? And then therefore, like, you are actually more important to me as a Club TED member. And that's all on chain. Now, like if I had the skill set to be doing it, you can look and I can be like, okay, I'm looking at Club TED. Here is the channels that they follow most. Here's where they're the most active. Who's my mutual with?
Yes.
What are they casting about? Like, what topics are they casting about? Pretty much all of that really rich, what I would say is a social identity. That's like your stated preference. Like everything about stated preference is completely accessible. And then to your point, like point of purchase or like the point of actually doing something that is a transaction is the revealed preference part. And very rarely do you have both.
That's right. I think like another way of saying that is it's like it's like a TED specific social graph that is yours. It's on chain. And
Yeah.
so,
This is actually why I don't understand why Bankless isn't spending more time on farcaster.
well, like I said, I think a lot of people don't like understand. They're not connecting the dots in this way yet. I think more people, like some people are, some people see the promise, but that, again, that is not at all evenly distributed. Like I think a lot of people are like, oh, cool, frames is kind of an open graph hack, like nice, but they're not thinking like
maybe it doesn't need to click for some people, like because like that's how the next, I think Dan even said like one of the most things he's most excited about are like who are these new voices that have emerged, and you and I are very lucky to have been two of those people. But it's like I do feel lucky, but also is that because we saw the opportunity and seized it?
I think it's a little bit of both, for sure. It's like for years, people were like, why do you spend so much time on farcaster? Like, that's not a good thing to do. Like, you shouldn't do that. I've like went all in on farcaster. I'm like, basically, this is the only distribution channel I have. Like, we're going to live or die by it. I'm like laser eyes for farcaster.
Same.
I think a lot of it is, there's this thing around connecting the dots, but then you actually have to connect them. It's like in like dot, it's like you can look at it and go, oh, that's a unicorn. And maybe you can see you're connecting the dots in your own mind and you can see that it's a unicorn, but not everyone can do that. Some people, you have to actually connect the dots and draw the unicorn for someone to be like, oh, that's a unicorn. And I think we're in the phase of frames where people who have a lot of context and who are really in it are like connecting the dots and seeing this unicorn. And I think there's people who are like maybe a little less active and they're just like, I don't get it. Like, I don't see what you see. And so I think in order for the world to see it, we actually need to draw the unicorn. Like, you actually have to show, oh, look, what this brand did. Like, as soon as we have gated frames, and you're on the cutting edge of this, but like as soon as you
my gated frame, yeah,
it's sick. But I mean, imagine if you're like, if you hold, if you've minted these specific NFTs, if you've clicked from these frames, if you follow these people, if you do these things, then you get this offer, you get this free mint, you get access to this event, etc. Like, as soon as that stuff starts actually happening, like, you can imagine the following situation. A brand goes, we want to host a party of like all the biggest influencers. And the way we're going to target them is by coming up with this list of requirements that they would have to have previously done on chain. They do it in a frame. All the right people do the thing. We then show up to the party. It's sick. We're happy. They're happy. It's a good outcome. As soon as that starts happening over and over and over again, I think the unicorn will be very clear. Like, a lot of people will be like, oh my God, we need to go to farcaster. This crazy growth spurt and everyone's like freaking out about farcaster. That like moment needs to happen over and over and over
and over and over again. I know.
Similar to Facebook.
I know.
It was almost like the light bulb went off on Facebook for people over like a decade. It was like people realized, oh my God. And I think the same thing needs to happen and can happen with farcaster.
I think a lot of like, the more that you can do in farcaster with warps is actually like more exciting. I want to be able to gift somebody like, I don't know, 5,000 warps, and then they never going to go through the process of like setting up a wallet and buying ETH and doing any of that. So that's like one thing. And then the other thing is I feel like a pretty loud critic right now about so many of these frames. And I think it's just because I'm impatient and like the whole like, oh, I see the dots and I'm connecting them. I think that the frames that will continue to like spark this momentum are frames that are taking a lot longer effort to make than the one-click ones.
Yeah, totally.
It would be really interesting if this next wave of growth actually doesn't come from something that the farcaster, Warpcast, Merkle team creates, but like somebody else who's like, wow, kind of what a new JSIC in a way. Like instead of degen, like what could it be next?
We're at an hour. Should we keep going?
We could talk for hours. So let us know what sparked, what resonated with you, what didn't resonate with you, and what we can do better. And that's it. Like we talked so long.